8.5. What are some examples of anarchy in action? Anarchism, more than anything else, is about the efforts of millions of revolutionaries changing the world in the last 2 centuries. Here, we will discuss some of the high points of this movement, all of them of a profoundly anti-capitalist nature. Anarchism is about radically changing the world, not just making the present system less inhuman by encouraging the anarchistic tendencies within it to grow and develop. While no purely anarchist revolution has taken place yet, there have been numerous ones with a highly anarchist character and level of participation. And while these have all been destroyed, in each case it has been at the hands of outside force brought against them, backed either by communists or capitalists, not because of any internal problems in anarchism itself. These revolutions, despite their failure to survive in the face of overwhelming force, have been both an inspiration for anarchists and the proof that anarchism is a viable social theory and can be practiced on a large scale. What these revolutions share is the fact that they are, to use Proudhon's term, a revolution from below. They were examples of collective activity, of popular spontaneity. It is only a transformation of society from the bottom up by the action of the oppressed themselves that can create a free society. As Proudhon asked, open quote, "What serious and lasting revolution was not made from below, by the people? For this reason, an anarchist is a revolutionary from below." Thus, the social revolutions and mass movements we discuss in this section are examples of popular self-activity and self-liberation. As Proudhon put it in 1848, the proletariat must emancipate itself, end quote. All anarchists echo Proudhon's idea of revolutionary change from below, the creation of a new society by the actions of the oppressed themselves. Bakunin, for example, argued that anarchists are, open quote, foes of all state organizations as such, and believe that the people can only be happy and free when organized from below by means of its own autonomous and completely free associations without the supervision of any guardians. It will create its own life, end quote. In section J.7, we discuss what anarchists think a social revolution is and what it involves. Many of these revolutions and revolutionary movements are relatively unknown to non-anarchists. Most people will have heard of the Russian Revolution, but few will know of the popular movements which were its lifeblood before the Bolsheviks seized power or the role that the anarchists played in it. Few will have heard of the Paris Commune, the Italian factory occupations, or the Spanish collectives. This is unsurprising for, as Herbert Reed notes, history, open quote, is of two kinds. A record of events that take place publicly, that makes the headlines in the newspapers and get embodied in official records. We might call this overground history. But taking place at the same time, preparing for these public events, anticipating them, is another kind of history that is not embodied in official records, an invisible underground history, end quote. Almost by definition, popular movements and revolts are part of underground history, the social history which gets ignored in favor of elite history, the accounts of the kings, queens, politicians, and wealthy, whose fame is the product of the crushing of the many. This means our examples of anarchy in action are part of what the Russian anarchist Volin called the unknown revolution. Volin used the expression as the title of his classic account of the Russian Revolution he was an active participant of. He used it to refer to the rarely acknowledged independent creative actions of the people themselves. As Volin put it, open quote, "It is not known how to study a revolution, and most historians mistrust and ignore those developments which occur silently in the depths of the revolution. At best, they accord them a few words in passing. Yet, it is precisely these hidden facts which are important, and which throw a true light on the events under consideration and on the period," end quote. Anarchism, based as it is on revolution from below, has contributed considerably to both the underground history and the unknown revolution of the past centuries, and this section of the FAQ will shed some light on its achievements. It is important to point out that these examples are of wide-scale social experiments and do not imply that we ignore the undercurrent of anarchist practice which exists in everyday life, even under capitalism. Both Peter Kropotkin in Mutual Aid and Colin Ward in Anarchy in Action have documented the many ways in which ordinary people, usually unaware of anarchism, have worked together as equals to meet their common interests. As Colin Ward argues, open quote, "An anarchist society, a society which organizes itself without authority, is always in existence, like a seed beneath the snow, buried under the weight of the state and its bureaucracy, capitalism and its waste, privilege and its injustices, nationalism and its suicidal loyalties, religious differences and their superstitious separatism." End quote. Anarchism is not only about a future society, it is also about the social struggle happening today. It is not a condition, but a process which we create by our self-activity and self-liberation. By the 1960s, however, many commentators were writing off the anarchist movement as a thing of the past. Not only had fascism finished off European anarchist movements in the years before and during the war, but in the post-war period, these movements were prevented from recovering by the capitalist West on one hand and the Leninist East on the other. Over the same period of time, anarchism had been repressed in the US, Latin America, China, Korea, where a social revolution with anarchist content was put down before the Korean War, and Japan. Even in the one or two countries that escaped the worst of the repression, the combination of the Cold War and international isolation saw libertarian unions like the Swedish SAC become reformist. But the 60s were a decade of new struggle, and all over the world, the New Left looked to anarchism as well as elsewhere for its ideas. Many of the prominent figures of the massive explosion of May 1968 in France considered themselves anarchists. Although these movements themselves degenerated, those coming out of them kept the idea alive and began to construct new movements. The death of Franco in 1975 saw a massive rebirth of anarchism in Spain, with up to 500,000 people attending the CNT's first post-Franco rally. The return to a limited democracy in some South American countries in the late 70s and 80s saw a growth in anarchism there. Finally, in the late 80s, it was anarchists who struck the first blows against the Leninist USSR, with the first protest march since 1928 being held in Moscow by anarchists in 1987. Today, the anarchist movement, although still weak, organizes tens of thousands of revolutionaries in many countries. Spain, Sweden, and Italy all have libertarian union movements organizing some 250,000 between them. Most other European countries have several thousand active anarchists. Anarchist groups have appeared for the first time in other countries, including Nigeria and Turkey. In South America, the movement has recovered massively. A contact sheet circulated by the Venezuelan anarchist group Correo A lists over 100 organizations in just about every country. Perhaps the recovery is slowest in North America, but there, too, all the libertarian organizations seem to be undergoing significant growth. As this growth accelerates, many more examples of anarchy in action will be created, and more people will take part in anarchist organizations and activities, making this part of the FAQ less and less important. However, it is essential to highlight mass examples of anarchism working on a large scale in order to avoid the specious accusation of utopianism. As history is written by the winners, these examples of anarchy in action are often hidden from view in obscure books. Rarely are they mentioned in the schools and universities, or if mentioned, they are distorted. Needless to say, the few examples we give are just that, a few. Anarchism has a long history in many countries, and we cannot attempt to document every example, just those we consider to be important. We are also sorry if these examples seem Eurocentric. We have, due to space and time considerations, had to ignore the Syndicalist Revolt 1910 to 1914 and the Shop Steward Movement 1917 to 21 in Britain, Germany 1919 to 21, Portugal in 1974, the Mexican Revolution, anarchists in the Cuban Revolution, the struggle in Korea against Japanese, then US and Russian imperialism during and after the Second World War, Hungary in 1956, the refusal of work revolt in the late 1960s, particularly in the hot autumn in Italy 1969, the UK miners' strike 1984 to 1985, the struggle against the poll tax in Britain, 1988 to 1992, the strikes in France in 1986 and 1995, the Italian Cobas movement in the 80s and the 90s, the popular assemblies and self-managed occupied workplaces during the Argentine Revolt at the start of the 21st century, and numerous other major struggles that have involved anarchist ideas of self-management. Ideas that usually develop from the movement themselves without anarchists necessarily playing a major or leading role. For anarchists, revolutions and mass struggles are festivals of the oppressed, when ordinary people start to act for themselves and change both themselves and the world.